Hey everyone! Today, let's talk about the Jutes, a Germanic tribe that had a huge impact on early Britain. Along with the Angles and Saxons, the Jutes arrived in Britain after the Romans left. According to a historian named Bede, the Jutes settled in areas like Kent, the Isle of Wight, and parts of Hampshire, leaving a lasting legacy in those regions. Nobody knows for sure where the Jutes originally came from. One idea is that they lived in the Jutland Peninsula but had to leave after a Danish invasion. They might have moved to the Frisian coast and then traveled to southern Britain in the late 400s. This was part of a larger movement of Germanic people into Britain that helped create what we now call England. There are some cool stories about this time in a book called the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle. It says two brothers, Hengist and Horsa, were invited by a British leader named Vortigern to help fight a group called the Picts. The brothers landed at a place called Whippetsfleet, now Ebbsfleet, beat the Picts, and then asked for more people to come over from their homeland. After that, lots of settlers from the Saxons, Angles, and Jutes came to Britain. The Saxons moved to places like Essex, Sussex, and Wessex. The Angles took over East Anglia, Mercia, and Northumbria, and the Jutes settled in Kent, the Isle of Wight, and southern Hampshire. There are also some interesting legends about Jutish leaders. The Chronicle talks about Withgar and Stuff, who are said to have founded settlements on the Isle of Wight. Another story mentions a man named Port and his sons, Beda and Megla, who started communities in southern Hampshire. Archaeologists think these settlers didn't just show up randomly, but followed old trade routes and settled in areas that were already important for trading and travel. The Jutes weren't just fighters. They were also farmers. Some historians think the Jutes influenced farming practices in Sussex and Kent. This suggests they might have helped shape farming in other areas too, maybe even as far as the New Forest. But life wasn't easy for the Jutes. Other groups started to put pressure on them. By the late 600s, a king from Mercia named Æthelberht invaded Kent and caused a lot of destruction. Later, a West Saxon king named Cædwalla decided to take over Jutish areas in southern England. His attacks were harsh, especially on the Isle of Wight, where he tried to wipe out the Jutish population. Still, the Jutes managed to stick around in some places, even as their land became part of larger kingdoms like Wessex. The Jutes story is all about moving to new places, settling down, fighting for survival, and adapting to change. They might not be as famous as the Saxons or Angles, but they played an important part in Britain's history. And the Jutes story gets even more interesting when we look at their culture and the impact they had on early Britain. When the Jutish kingdom of Kent was established in the middle of the 5th century, the Roman influence was still very much alive. For example, the Roman settlement of Duravernum Cantiacorum evolved into what we now know as Canterbury. The people of Kent were referred to as Cantawara, a name that blended Latin roots with Germanic language. Bede's account of the settlement of Britain by Angles, Saxons, and Jutes has been debated by historians, but archaeological findings back up the idea that the west and east parts of Kent were culturally distinct. West Kent leaned more towards its Saxon neighbors, while East Kent, along with the Isle of Wight and southern Hampshire, showed influences from the Franks and the North Sea region. The jewelry unearthed in these areas, brooches and bracteates, shows a blend of styles, possibly crafted by artisans trained in Roman workshops, who later developed their own unique techniques. Around 580, Kent saw the arrival of Bertha, a Frankish princess who married Æthelberht, the king of Kent. Bertha was a Christian and brought a bishop, Leodhard, with her. Æthelberht allowed her to continue practicing her faith and even repurposed an old Roman building, dedicating it to Saint Martin. This set the stage for a significant shift in the region's spiritual landscape. In 597, Pope Gregory I sent Augustine on a mission to convert the Anglo-Saxons. By then, Æthelberht might have already been baptized, making him the first Anglo-Saxon ruler to adopt Christianity. This period also introduced Christian burial practices, with graves aligned east to west, a departure from earlier pagan customs. The Isle of Wight, however, lagged behind in embracing Christianity. It wasn't until 686, after King Cedwalla of Wessex invaded, that the island was evangelized. Cedwalla's campaign was brutal, wiping out the local king, Arwald, and his brothers. Meanwhile, Kent continued to practice a system of inheritance known as gavelkind, which allowed land to be divided equally among heirs. This system persisted in Kent until the early 20th century and is linked to the region's Jutish heritage. As for their origins, the Jutes' homeland is still a topic of debate. While Bede placed them in the Jutland Peninsula, other evidence points to northern Francia or Frisia. It's possible that the Danes pushed the Jutes out of Jutland around AD 200, forcing some to assimilate into Danish culture and others to migrate. Interestingly, some medieval Scandinavian sources mention the Jutes as a subgroup of the Danes. There's also speculation connecting the Jutes with the Geats from southern Sweden. This theory suggests they may have shared common ancestry or cultural ties, as seen in the Old English poem, Beowulf, and historical accounts like Asser's Life of Alfred. The connections remain a puzzle, but they highlight the intertwined histories of these early tribes. By piecing together archaeological finds, historical texts, and cultural practices, we get a clearer picture of how the Jutes contributed to the fabric of early Britain.